welcome to this boundary-spanning symposium. SysSync is very happy to have you here. I'm Margaret Palmer. I'm director of SysSync. I have the pleasure, actually, of introducing today's keynote speaker, Michael Watts. Dr. Watts is a Centennial Professor of International Development at the London School of Economics and Emeritus Professor of Geography and Development Studies at UC Berkeley. He's really one of the most influential and leading figures in the field of geography and political ecology. His transformational career has not only extended what we know about the intersection of social justice, natural environments, and power, but he's pioneered those connections at a time when few people had even heard of socio-environmental or socio-ecological systems. Beginning with his groundbreaking book, Silent Violence, Dr. Watts was one of the first to demonstrate the value of coupling social and environmental perspectives. He's carried on this tradition throughout his career, which is easily seen in the titles of a number of his books. These have been instrumental in understanding the ecological drivers and consequences of uneven access to resources and violent unrest, and in demonstrating the value of cross-disciplinary collaborations. But he's not just a thinker, he's a doer. We all know that SE systems research is hard. Few know that as well as Dr. Watts, who was even shot while conducting research in 2007. No, he has no controversy. He has an ongoing commitment, though, to his work, even when things get rough, and he has set a high standard for all of us to aspire to. Welcome, Dr. Watts.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Margaret, for your generous words. My charge today, as I understand it, is to say something about crossing boundaries between social and ecological systems. And of course, the very language of boundaries and borders is freighted at this moment in history, whether we're referring to the Mexico-US border or South Korea-North Korea, all of which is to say, given the fact that I'm going to talk today about the oil and gas industry, this could well devolve into another harangue against the current administration. And the last thing you want to hear, I think, from someone who lives in San Francisco is more fake news. So I'll try to withhold a little bit my tendency to go in that direction, but I will try to address this question of crossing boundaries. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk specifically about one type of set of socio-ecological, socio-environmental systems that turn on the global energy sector, oil and gas in particular. I know studying the oil and gas industry is not everyone's idea of a good time, but someone has to do it. And I'm going to be talking about the upstream, that is to say the exploration and production side of the global energy industry. And I'm going to see that sector, or those industries, oil and gas production, as a particular type of socio-ecological system. That's what I'd like to explore, and typically occurring in particular types of geographies or spaces that I'm going to refer to as resource or oil frontiers. And if I have anything to say today, it's about trying to give a flavor for what it is that's peculiar about these frontier settings that might have important consequences for us understanding how particular types of socio-ecological couplings function. I want to know then, or pose a couple of basic questions. Why is it that some spaces, some frontier areas, seem to be more dangerous and risky than others, making some events more likely than others? Why is it that some types of frontiers seem to accumulate risks and insecurities in a way which makes certain sorts of outcomes, environmental or political for that matter, almost inevitable, overdetermined? How is it then that these frontier areas, as it were, are in some way organically connected to certain types of emergent properties that emerge from socio-ecological systems, which I'm going to call vulnerability and risk, that in turn tend to produce emergent events, catastrophic environmental events? To do that, I'm going to talk about two quite different parts of the world, the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of Guinea. These are both oil-producing regions. Gulf of Mexico, specifically, of course, the outer continental shelf, a marine, aquatic environment, increasingly in deep water. The Gulf of Guinea, I'm going to be talking about Nigeria, mostly onshore production in the Niger Delta in the southeast of the country. They're both in a way, enormously different types of histories, political economies, different types of ecologies, obviously. But they are both types of resource frontiers, oil and gas frontiers, that I think allow us to say something about socio-ecological systems. Okay, let me just start then with Outer Continental Shelf Gulf of Mexico. Largest U.S. oil-producing region, generates typically about $70 billion a year, $2 trillion of assets, 50,000 wells have been drilled there, 5,000 in deep water, more than 1,000 feet. Louisiana is the heart of that economy, as you know, oil and gas economy, and indeed it was the center point for the move from onshore production in Louisiana to offshore. That happened in 1947. Those of you that are as old as me or who like Jimmy Stewart movies, remember Thunder Bay? Thunder Bay is about the 1947 first out-of-sight offshore rig. That move to offshore expanded, of course, very rapidly in the 1980s under the Reagan administration when James Watt, no relation, was head of the Department of the Interior, which produced what was called area-wide leasing, a massive sale-off, 1 billion acres in the 80s and again in the 1990s. 50,000 wells, 7,000 active leases, etc., etc. In other words, a major infrastructural offshore investment in this part of the world. By 2000, deep water production topped shallow water production. There was what the Presidential Commission, which I'll refer to in just a second, on the Gulf of Mexico, referred to as a stampede offshore, was accounting for that dominance of deep water 1,000-foot production by 2000. Let me just say that, of course, by the mid-2000s, hard to believe, but offshore production, drilling was happening in 9,000 feet of water through 30,000 feet of sediments. As the oil and gas industry, I've spent a lot of time talking to people in the oil and gas industry, make perfectly clear that getting oil under those circumstances is in fact as complicated as putting a man or woman on the moon. I'll come back to that in just a second. Move offshore then, increasingly into deep water. Technologically complex, technologically demanding, what the President's Commission of 2011 referred to as formidable tests. I'm going to look at, of course, surprise, surprise, one particular event, the Deepwater Horizon BP well named Macondo, drilling a semi-submersible rig, Deepwater Horizon, in April 2010. A blowout. Deepwater Horizon was a rig that had a fantastic track record, incidentally. It was operating at about 5,000 feet of water. BP had acquired the acreage in 2080. They were renting this rig with this fantastic track record for $1 million a day. That's the going day rate, more or less. It was a multinational enterprise in the sense that Transnational owned the rig. Halliburton was doing some of the technical work, the cementing and casing. Hyundai had made the rig itself, etc., etc. Without going through too many of the details of this, let me just say that the Macondo well was a high-pressure, high-temperature well. That's to say it had about 13,000 pounds per square inch pressure at the bottom of the well. Deep water production of this sort, as you all know, involves a very complicated system of controlling and regulating a circulatory system of fluids and gases, muds, brines, drilling fluids, and of course the oil and gas itself. A circulatory system involving tanks, pits, pumps, sensors, all held together by piping. In the case of Macondo, 2.5 miles of tubular steel hanging from the semi-submersible, 18,000 feet into sediments, concrete cap at the bottom. It was a difficult, nasty well. Lots of drilling fluids had been lost along the way, 16,000 barrels. They were running behind schedule, 40 days actually. There were cost overruns as a result of that. By some estimations, 58 million on a 98 million budget. That was the context in which then this happened. And what this was of course, the blowout. Gas seeped into the well itself on the evening of the 20th of April. Mud and water shot up and out through the derrick, followed by an enormous kick of gas. I generally don't like to promote Hollywood movies, but I have to say, somewhat reluctantly, that the Deepwater Horizon movie, if those of you who want to know what it's like, life on a rig, actually very interesting. And whilst it cuts some corners on things like corporate responsibility, actually, about which I will be talking, I do think it's an interesting Hollywood production. Anyway, there it was. Enormous spill. As you know, 11 people tragically died on the 126-person rig. Nutshell of the dimensions: 5 million barrels, 800,000 contained. At its maximal coverage, actually 112,000 square kilometers. 7,000 cubic meters of oil dispersing agents were applied, the largest historical of its sort. Much of that was thrown at the well itself. As you know, the presumption was that such a blowout in deep water could never happen. Why? Because sitting on the well is a blowout preventer. That blowout preventer, under these sorts of circumstances of a gas kick, the blind shear ram severs the riser. Didn't happen. So the very event itself was precisely predicated on an event that by definition couldn't happen. 35% of the Gulf was affected. It's been referred to as the worst environmental disaster in US history. It occurred, of course, on the 40th anniversary of Earth Day. Largest disaster of its sort, 50,000 responders, 6,500 vessels, 125 planes, rigs, etc., etc., etc. A massive effort. I'm not going to talk, incidentally, too much about the response effort itself. Some of you would know much more than I. It was as much a disaster as the blowout itself. And the damage done particularly to BP and the then CEO, Mr. Hayward, bears no reiteration. When you have the head of the company in front of news cameras saying that, in fact, he was having a bad day. He was having a bad day. You know that there are going to be reputational fallouts from this. And indeed there was financial, federal and civil litigation. Currently it's running at 65 billion, and litigation is still continuing. There was a presidential commission which gave its report in 2011. It, of course, was a complex document, but it pointed out a series of technical failures having to do with the blowout preventer failing. Certain pressure testings were either not conducted or misinterpreted. The cement casings for the well were questionable, etc., etc. What we can say is, in fact, that undetected a large quantity of hydrocarbons entered into the bottom of the well. As it was being prepared for temporary abandonment, they were going to plug it and come back to it. They had to move that rig quickly. It was costing them $1 million a day to another major BP acreage called Cascada. And if it didn't get there by May 10th, it lost the lease. In other words, all of this was done under enormous pressure. Due to the displacement inside the well, upper 8,300 feet of heavy drilling fluids with lighter seawater, there were large reductions in pressures inside the well that allowed substantial quantities of gas to come up. Those gas rose in the well bore, expanding as they went, entered lower pressure areas near the surface. Seawater drilling mud fluids pushed upward onto the derrick and ignited. It was a massive failed engineering project. My colleague, Bob B., some of you may know, professor of engineering. I'm going to say a bad word for those of you, but it's a literal quote. Bob, when describing this, said it was indeed a complex failure in complex ways. He described it as quote, a massive clusterfuck, unquote. I think it was. I'd like to try to give you a little more analytical acuity, if I may. All right, there's one case. This is one case. The heart of American capitalism, you might say. Here's a second case. Niger Delta, Nigeria. Very different environment, largely onshore. Nigeria is a major oil producer. The Niger Delta, tropical swamp forest, barrier islands, a beautiful part of the world, 20,000 square miles in the southeast littoral of the country. It's been a major oil producer since 1960, the 9th or 10th largest, producing relatively sweet, meaning low sulfur oil, historically for the US market, increasingly now for India and for China. Again, a major infrastructural development, mostly onshore. Interestingly, in May 2007, during the Deepwater Horizon crisis, remember, that lasted for 87 days. 87 days. There was no precedent for trying to control such a situation. In the midst of that, in May 2010, was a report by Shell, an operator in Nigeria, reporting, as it does annually, that it was responsible for 14,000 tons of oil in the Niger Delta. Between 2005 and 2009, it was responsible for something like 300,000 barrels. Shell is one of 5 major companies and 20 other companies, each of which have equally horrid spill records. All of which is to say that there are thousands of oil spills, not a catastrophic spill of the 5 million barrels that we saw in the Gulf, but serial spills that have been happening, the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez, up until Deepwater Horizon, the largest oil spill in the US, since 1960. So this then, just a sense of some figures on this. This is a very small area, but it's in some sense representative of the Niger Delta, 400 square miles, 400 spills between 85 and 2003. So again, this is just a massive serial regularized spill, which on an annualized basis would be the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez. The World Wildlife Foundation refers to this part of the world as one of the most polluted places on the planet. All of this, however, in the early 2000s had a different set of dynamics. It was partly about corporate neglect. It was partly about no regulatory oversight by a very corrupt Nigerian state. But by the middle of the 2000s, this was an area in which there was massive sabotage, an insurgency by armed militants against the Nigerian government, and hot tapping, that's to say oil theft, of pipelines, much of which produced all sorts of oil spillages. Let me just say, to give you a sense of the order of magnitude of this, something like 10 to 15% of Nigerian oil production is stolen. I could talk forever about that industry, how it operates. I won't. But just take it from me, it's in fact a mass, that amounts to oil production larger than a considerable number of oil companies. Okay. So here then the dynamics producing the environmental catastrophe are of a rather different sort. I'm just going to show you some pictures. A photographer I've been working with for the last decade. 14,000 pipeline attacks. 14,000. Oil theft and refining. This is Edward Pertinsky's of an explosion around an illegal oil refinery. Okay, so 2 cases. On their face, then, very different. These are both have, if you like, socio-ecological systems that have certain sorts of crisis qualities. They're both producing regions. They're both federal systems. Nigeria is a 36-state federation, not unlike with a similar constitution to the US. Both are, I guess, forms of functioning democracy. I will leave you to determine the particular nature of our functioning democracy with powerful corporate players and forms of regulatory structure in place. One, of course, Nigeria, looks more like a corrupt, rather violent petro-state. The other looks rather more like a market-based system in which there was a massive engineering failure. But they both then they're both instances of socio-ecological systems in which certain sorts of risks, I'm going to argue, these are its frontier qualities, began to accumulate. It pushed. What I want to argue is that these frontier resources, these frontier areas, are precisely zones in which risks tend to be manufactured. They're generated and accumulated that push the system, the sociological system, closer to the edge, so to speak. Right? they emerge out of emergent properties, systemic risk and vulnerabilities, different in both cases, that produce emergent events of a catastrophic nature. That's the argument I want to make, and that they're rooted in something that I'll try to explain, this notion of a frontier. What type of resource frontier is it? I guess I'm here want to try to link for you then oil frontiers with what I'm calling emergent properties, systemic structural risk and forms of precariousness, and emergent events, catastrophic crises, environmental and or political. In both cases, these environmental crises were, of course, simultaneously political crises of legitimacy of what government was or was not doing, crises of corporate legitimacy, of what companies were or were not doing. Okay. So these are complicated crises in which the ecological, the political, and the economic, of course, crossing boundaries, intersect. Right, let me just then say a word about frontiers. Frontiers, of course, for us, the United States, comes with a lot of baggage. Right? You know the great, you probably know all, the great historian who published a wonderful essay on the American frontier, the opening and closing of the frontier, and its significance. Okay. Jackson said that, quote, the peculiarity of American institutions is the fact that they've been compelled to adapt themselves to an expanding people, to the changes involved in crossing the continent, winning a wilderness. He said that circumstances peculiar to the American frontier, what he called free land, opportunity, common danger from Native American Indian communities, shaped the American character, consolidated and nationalized America, promoted democracy. He said, quote, to the frontier, the American intellect owes its striking characteristics of inventiveness. If you don't know what your striking characteristics are, here they are. Inventiveness, practicality, inquisitiveness, restlessness, optimism, and individualism. All of that emerged for Jackson out of the process of the frontier. Now, of course, that notion has been hammered by historians to make the point that, of course, it was violent and nasty and the rule of law was... But what it points to, nonetheless, is something that I want to come to, is that it's a frontier in which questions of law and order and institutional presence and state authority are key. And to that extent, again, I could prattle on forever about this. It seems to me that at Berkeley I've taught courses for a long, long time on the mafia, for reasons that I won't go into. But this is a wonderful book. If you're looking for a great recommendation, check out this book by Anton Bloch. He says, why did the mafia arise in the 1850s in Western Sicily? I will tell you why, says Bloch. Because it's a frontier area. What's a frontier area? A frontier area is precisely an area in which, in this case, the Italian post-Risorgimento state could not exercise its infrastructural and despotic powers out there to Sicily. There was a security vacuum. And in the context, in fact, of political turbulence in Sicily and struggles between big landowners and peasants, then a class emerged, peasant entrepreneurs providing such protection services that in turn became an economy, the mafia. So then, what are frontiers for my purposes? Seems to me this points then to a rather different notion of frontiers, that frontiers are wrapped up with the relationship between places and institutions and processes, and especially those of the state. Lucien Febvre, the great historian, says that a given sort of state, says Febvre, we get certain sorts of frontiers. A social space in which forms of rule and authority are in question. James Ron, a sociologist, distinguishes between ghettos, which he sees as ethnic or national enclaves trapped within a dominant state, from frontiers that are weakly institutionalized spaces, this is his language, not tightly integrated into adjacent core states, shaped by uneven and incomplete authority. This is essentially what I see Mr. Markov saying here. So what I want to suggest to you then is that these resource frontiers typically, even though they will vary, of course, given the local context, they have these sorts of generic properties. Now, of course, in the context of the oil and gas industry, oil frontiers have a specific set of meanings, peculiar to the industry. You will know, of course, that new oil frontiers are being opened up all of the time. Currently in parts of Siberia, currently off in coastal Namibia. There are always new discoveries, even though no one anymore in the oil business expects to find big, enormous, massive fields of the sort that were discovered in Saudi Arabia in the 1920s and 30s. There are new frontiers, oil frontiers, all the time. The Arctic happens to be one. You will recall 2017, a Russian submarine with 2 parliamentarians aboard planted a titanium flag 2 miles down under the North Pole. At stake were lucrative oil and gas fields. The oil and gas, shale gas regime, obviously, is another example of exactly this type of oil frontier. And in the oil and gas industry, then, frontiers refer to the process by which a petroleum province with certain sorts of properties, there's a source rock with rich carbon content, there's a sedimentary reservoir rock which has pore space to hold significant qualities of petroleum, and a non-porous sedimentary rock which is a barrier creating the reservoir, that petroleum process, that process by which the petroleum province is converted into what's called a working petroleum system. Which is to say, then, that discovery of a reservoir opens up the appraisal and development of a field. And what that requires is looking in environmental terms at the biophysical properties of the geological formation. Right? The properties of the reservoir rock, the fluids that it contains, the fluid dynamics, the temperature, their composition and specific gravity and viscosity of the oil. And all of those things shape ultimate recovery. How much you can get out, the peak volumes and peak production of the field, the life and well flow rates, how many wells you need. All of this stuff emerges out of the frontier process. Okay. So a frontier process in the oil and gas industry, then, is the process, a spatial and temporal process by which that happens. What I'm saying is I want to deposit that notion on the larger landscape of the frontier, as I was discussing earlier, using that quote of Markov and the mafia. Now, one last thing that I need to do before I can then just walk you through these examples is, of course, to talk a little bit about the specific differences between these two cases in terms of how, in social terms, the social part of the socio-environmental system of the frontier is organized. And just to simplify here, what we could simply say is the following. If we take, there are 2 very different types of oil regimes. Okay. One, in the case of Nigeria, is sometimes referred to as contractual. What it means is, and this is the case, as you probably know, for many global south oil-producing states, Saudi Arabia, Ecuador, Indonesia. You set up a national oil company, an NOC. You nationalize mineral rights. You compel the majors to have joint ventures with you. You establish a memorandum of understanding in which government take is typically about 80 cents on the dollar. Those oil revenues are captured by the state and flow directly into it. Now, sorry, I'm going to lose my papers here if I'm not careful. In this particular case, then, in the Nigerian case, and other cases, is that contractual model has the effect of centralizing enormous resource wealth, oil revenues within the state, and then develops a mechanism for distributing those oil revenues. And don't forget, in oil-producing states like Nigeria, let me say Nigeria in particular, 85% of government revenue comes from oil. 85%. 98% of oil exports come from oil. Okay. So you have this contractual system of that sort. That's rather different, obviously, from the type of Gulf of Mexico outer continental shelf system that we were talking about just previously. Here, of course, as you know, back in the 1950s, through the Submerged Lands Act and the Continental Shelf Act, the federal government, through the Department of the Interior and U.S. Coast Guard, controls leasing arrangements. The DOI prepares a 5-year plan. There are federal control over the OCS, and they are then bid by oil companies who have that acreage, and then they have to exploit that acreage within certain time periods. Okay. So as of 2017, 30,000 tracts have been leased in that way through over 200 systems of sale, and the mechanism which regulated that up through the Deepwater horizon was a federal organization called MMS, the Minerals Management Service. It was responsible for oversight, it was responsible for oil and environmental safety regulations, and also collecting revenues. So it had in the heart of it, set up in the 1980s, a contradiction. One side of it was it's in its interest to maximize revenues, get more oil leases, get more oil production. On the other, it had a safety and environmental and oversight function. Okay. Two very different types of systems then. One is a nationalized system, one is a concessionary system through royalties. They have different political economies. That's the social content. So what I'm trying to do here, as you can see then, is just simply to give content to these two oil frontiers. As oil frontiers and frontiers in general, as a type of socio-ecological system. And the social content are quite different in both sorts of cases. Okay. Let me then go back, and I'm just going to walk you very briefly through both of these cases and what we can learn from them. Deepwater. First, a huge growth of offshore deepwater production. It began particularly in the 1980s and up through the 1990s. Two, it was increasingly complex, as I've already mentioned. The depth of water increased very substantially. Right? The presumption was that blowouts couldn't happen because of the blowout preventer. But the MMS, the regulatory agency in 2010, did not have a comprehensive set of regulations specifically addressing deep water technology. In other words, deep water technology had gone out front very, very rapidly. As a result of the complexity of all of this, there was an increase in oil spills. Blowouts increased by 81% in the 1990s, and between 2006 and the Deepwater Horizon blowout, there was an oil spill every 2 months. And the last thing that I'll just mention here is, of course, that the BP's presence in offshore production had increased hugely, from being essentially almost invisible back in the 1970s. It grew by the 2000s to be the largest, larger than Chevron and Shell put together, and the lowest cost producer. And it did that on the backs, as some of you will remember, a major reorganization of the company. BP was a national company. It was privatized under Mrs. Thatcher, and it began to have a reputation through its decentralized reorganization. It began to have a reputation for lack of safety. BP was cited by OSHA 760 times between 2007 and 2010. The second highest violation was by Sunoco, which had 8. They decentralized away into what was called asset federations, in which all of the incentives were essentially decentralized to asset managers. I'll come back to that in just a second. All of which is to say then, these were the forces that at work that led up to the Deepwater Horizon. There has been a whole raft of reports. I'll just simply show a few of them here, including the President's Commission, 21 official reports. They tended to focus on errors, technical errors in the casing and cementing of the well, errors in the reading of well sensors, the failure of the blowout preventer, BP's culture of safety. These were typically the things that were flagged. I just thought I'd show you that. Bringing oil to American shores is probably not what Mr. Hayward had in mind at that point. So they focused on this part of the system, the circulatory system, as being where the errors were, and the fact that the well itself changed shape over time, BP's internal investigation identified 4 things. Well integrity, that's not our fault, that's the well drillers. Hydrocarbons entered, the drillers lost control of the well. Barriers, bad monitoring, not our fault. Hydrocarbons ignited, barriers that failed, etc., etc. That's the problem with Deepwater Horizon. Blowout preventer. So in BP's analysis, of course, it simply, predictably, identified the other partners in the drilling enterprise. But Obama's National Commission pointed to the safety culture, and it also about the lack of regulatory oversight. And that seems to me to be important in terms of understanding then these frontier qualities. And I'm just going to briefly go through them. It seems to me one aspect then of this frontier was what I would call the political economy of licensing. That there was a massive land rush in the 80s and 1990s, largely unregulated, that the MMS had a built-in contradiction in which it became more interested in revenue maximization than its oversight functions. Secondly, this is a case of regulatory evisceration and regulatory capture. What do I mean by that? MMS was established in a political era where the desire was to unburden industry from government regulation. Secondly, MMS had a reputation of having strong cultural connections to the industry. One regional supervisor referred to it as pro-industry to the point of being blind. Thirdly, no president and no Congress has ever sought funding commensurate with MMS's mission. In fact, its operating budget declined in the 15 years prior to 2010. In 2010, there was one drilling engineer responsible for the issuance of all permits in its New Orleans office. And indeed, Gulf Inspection had 55 people for 3,000 oil facilities. And not least, MMS itself was captured in the sense that it was widely understood to be extraordinarily corrupt, accepting gifts and vacations from big oil. The Inspector General's report in 2007 made this absolutely clear. Third aspect of the frontier, I refer to as states of exception. What is interesting about the regulation of outer continental shelf production is that through a series of legislations, the Department of the Interior was granted powers of override to waive and exempt certain types of activities. A 1981 ruling exempted the Gulf OCS, outer continental shelf, from a full environmental review. After September 11, President Bush streamlined, which is to say granted waivers, to the permitting process. The same thing happened in 2008. So then the regulatory process is constantly subject to exemptions and waivers. And not last but not least, there is the question of corporate accountability and market competition. And all I'd return to here is BP itself. Its reorganization and its drive to become low cost, and the fact that it was confronting, in this case, a series of challenges, not only its safety record, not only the fact that it knew in 2009 that the Deepwater Horizon rig had not been into dry dock for 9 years, required 390 repairs, ignored that completely, but it was pressured by the fact that it needed to complete quickly to move on to other acreage, adjacent acreage, which it would have lost if it did not meet the May deadlines. So interestingly here, for those of you who are industrial organization types, big oil is a type of just-in-time system. You are moving rigs, you're paying $1 million a day around to exploit, and they were under an incredible crunch. And this produced, as one person at the Presidential Commission reported, who was on the rig, that we were, quote, drilling like a bat out of hell to getting things done. Okay. So what would I conclude from this? I would say then that these things that I've just walked you through, not that there weren't misreadings of sensors. Not that certain testing, those things absolutely happened. That's what Bob B was talking about. But the context within which these could happen was precisely wrapped up with the frontier, a lap of regulatory oversight, regulatory capture, market competition by an aggressive company, the pressures of geopolitics for national oil self-sufficiency in the early 2000s. All of these things then produced a situation in which, to return to Markov, law and order and forms of authority were being stretched, elastic, or not present. And for me, just speaking very frankly, all of that is wrapped up. I would describe that as a type of neoliberal frontier. It's a frontier that's the product of a commitment to a particular type of market ideology. In 2 minutes. And what that was about was not just the event itself, but how over time risks and insecurities were accumulating. It made the assumption that, in fact, a subsea blowout was, in fact, low probability, high catastrophic. It actually made it into a high probability event. It overdetermined that outcome, which is precisely the accumulations of risks and insecurities, an emergent property, systemic vulnerability. It made it, in my view, almost inevitable. So when Professor Nancy Levinson gave testimony to the Commission in 2011, she said, the way that the Macondo well was designed and operated made an accident highly probable. Well, it wasn't just the well design. It was the well design that was part of a frontier system that made it almost inevitable. All right, in 2 minutes. The Nigerian case is very different, and I'm not going to go through it, but you can just see where I'm going with this. That in the Nigerian case, for the reasons that I explained, it's mostly onshore. So the oil industry had to deal with communities that were directly affected by the industry itself. Okay? And in the case of Nigeria, what we saw was that oil wealth was captured by the state and produced an enormously corrupt political class, which not only did it produce oil, this is the IMF, not known for their exaggeration. Oil did not seem to add to the standard of living and could have contributed to a decline. Right? The Nigerian state is not even corruption, it's organized crime, said the head of the anti-crime unit. Billions of dollars get stolen. What's the consequence of this? The consequence of this is that the oil fields not only feel the brunt of those oil spills, but they get none of the material or economic benefits. And it was out of that that the insurgency arose, and the insurgency in turn targeted oil infrastructure, among other things, and promoted oil theft. And I'm what here referring to as a class of masterless men. What I'm referring to here is that the young men who I spent a lot of time interviewing and talking to felt themselves not just pissed off about this corrupt Nigerian state that wasn't illegitimate, that wasn't, in some sense, they weren't getting their cut of the oil revenues, but they were excluded from all systems of authority that they felt were equally corrupt. State government, local government, the organized religion, local chiefs who were in bed with the oil companies. When things got funky in the 2000s, the oil companies started throwing money at the problem to keep the oil flowing. Shell was spending $250 million a year on cash payments. That's cash payments that are made to chiefs. Talk to these guys, slow them down. So it was a big, crappy system, as Chinua Achebe described it. Actually, what he described was a big, he said, Nigeria is a big, crappy family. So what I'm saying here then is here are also, this was the frontier form. No regulatory oversight, corrupt states. The state was withdrawing. A very different set of Markovian frontier situations that produced a simultaneous insurgency, right, and an equally profound set of environmental and political problems. Okay, so just to conclude that, I hope I've given you a sense of how under some circumstances, in resource frontier conditions. We can begin to realize, apropos the definition that I provided you with, that frontiers are these places where law, order, authority, jurisdiction, for differing reasons, in the name of market ideology or in the name of, not neoliberalism in the case of Nigeria, but the post-colonial politics, gets pulled and stretched in a particular way that permits certain things to happen. And some of those things are the accumulation of risks and insecurities, what I've called precarity. And interestingly, and this is what I'll end with, both of these crises, in a sense, end in the same way. The crises get folded back into the system. What happens in Deepwater? Sure, BP gets 65 billion. Wiped? Yes, it does. But within 2 years, it's back drilling in deeper water. So, it costs you. And don't forget, even though there was regulatory reform after 2005, it took, in fact, many years, took 5 years actually to get there. And the new regulations didn't arise until 2016, and the director responsible for those regulations last year simply said, I'm, quote, not confident that the problem is resolved. So on the one hand, then, this system has some capacity to absorb these shocks, this socio-ecological, to absorb in exactly the same way. And I'll end here, Nigeria. What happened in Nigeria? Well, there was an amnesty. What did the government do? It put on its wage bill as salaried workers 30,000 former militants. And then it threw a bunch of money at the Niger Delta and said, well, this will make things better for you. Well, surprise, surprise, last year we've seen a re-emergence of a new insurgency. So both of these systems then seemingly, in spite of their frontier qualities, seemingly have this capacity as systems to both generate these emergent properties and events and at the same time absorb them. It could be a depressing place to leave. I don't know. But it's an observation that at least I've come around to thinking about. Thank you very much.